So what do you all think about AI or artificial intelligence? You've probably been involved in some conversations about this upcoming technology because let's face it, this is becoming a very popular conversation in our culture today, especially as this technology is advancing. And just last month, I went to a ministry conference and they had a whole seminar on technology in the church. And a big part of that conversation was about artificial intelligence. And there were some really good points in that whole conversation, even just about technology in general. And I'm curious if any of you can relate to this. This is material that was adapted from a man named Douglas Adams. And this is about how different age demographics relate to technology. So that's the next slide here. It says, anything invented before you were born is just normal, part of the landscape, the environment. Anything invented after you were born, but before you were 30, is a marvelous invention, really cool stuff. Anything invented after you turn 30 is a problem. It's going to destroy civilization and mess everything up. Now, could you guys relate to any of that there? And maybe if you're older than 30, you might be thinking, hasn't anybody seen the Terminator movies? Like, don't we know what happens when we make robots smarter than us and then just let them off the leash? So are robots going to, take over the world in 50 years? I don't know. But it seems to me that technology developers and even the younger generation seem to be less concerned about robots taking over the world and just more excited about the good things that AI can do for us. So here's just a list of some of the things that artificial intelligence can do for us. It can create pictures, music, and scripts from prompts. They can learn both from programming and from experience. They can analyze large quantities of data, translate different languages, drive cars, and even mimic human relationships through intelligent and emotional communication. Now, it's not that these robots are actually emotional, but they can communicate in a way that kind of sounds emotional. Now, I think a lot of people would say, well, technology isn't necessarily good or bad. Technology can be used for good, and technology can be used for bad. Either way, even if that is true, I think what we need to remember is that technology is not passive. What I mean by that is technology is constantly shaping the world that we live in. It's shaping the way that we work. It shapes the way that we rest. It shapes how we go about recreation and entertainment. It even shapes the way that we go about relationships. And one of the biggest concerns that I've heard as it's related to artificial intelligence isn't that robots are going to pick up guns and take over the world. But one of the greatest concerns is the way that this kind of technology is impacting relationships, at least the way that our society goes about relationships. So you can get some apps off of the App Store, and you can have them on your phone or a different device. And these apps allow you to create a fictional AI character. And then you can communicate with that AI character through text messages and other forms of communication in a really similar way to how you can communicate with a real person. And through your interaction with this fake artificial character, you can program them to be the kind of person that you would want in a friend. You can kind of program them through that experience for them to say the kinds of things that you want them to say. And so you have people forming relationships with robots. I know this sounds so crazy, and so this is probably going to blow your minds, but some of these relationships even turn romantic. I came across this statistic. It says in April of 2025 survey of 2,000 Gen Z respondents, 80% said they'd consider marrying an AI partner. 83% said they could have a deep emotional bond with one. Now, this isn't just in the realm of possibilities. This is the kind of thing that is actually going on today. And I was listening to a therapist talking about this, and she said that one of the dangers in how AI is shaping the way that our society goes about relationships is that healthy human relationships have a certain element of give and take. We all know this to be true from our own experience, right? Now, the problem with forming relationships with a robot is you don't have that give and take like you would in a real relationship. It's just take from the robot. And so, in a sense, while we can program AI to be everything that we would want in a friend, we could program an AI bot to talk to us the way we want to be talked to. What we might be less aware of is the way that our society is being programmed by AI. Something that I've heard about over and over again over the last few years is that our culture is in a crisis of loneliness and isolation. And I think those apps, like I just described, where you can have an AI friend to talk to, is kind of a response to this loneliness, to this isolation. But I don't think that's the ultimate solution. I think people turn to robots for relationships because it seems like a better alternative to real, messy, hard relationships. When you can have a relationship with a robot, that's 100% easy. You can talk to that robot anytime you want to. That robot will tell you exactly what you want to hear, and it's a very one-sided relationship. And I totally get that people would want to go that direction just because real relationships take work. Real relationships can have ups and downs. Real relationships can be dysfunctional. And so the solution to dysfunctional relationships, the solution to loneliness and isolation, I don't believe is found in just more and better technology. I really believe that the solution to dysfunctional relationships is healthy relationships. I think that the solution to loneliness and isolation are to have real relationships with real people. And that's where the church comes in. The church is all about relationships. The church is not a building. The church is not just a program or even a Sunday morning event. The church is a group of believers who get together to worship God and to be who God has called them to be. And all throughout the Bible, the church is actually referred to as a family of believers. Check out what it says in 1 Peter here. It says, "Stay alert, watch out for your great enemy, the devil. He prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. Stand firm against him and be strong in your faith. Remember that your family of believers all over the world is going through the same kind of suffering you are." So if you have turned to Jesus as your Lord and Savior, you are part of this family of believers. And the church, just like any relationship, just like any family, can either be healthy or dysfunctional. And God's heart is for the church to be healthy, to be a positive example of healthy, loving, supportive relationships. And so what we're going to do this morning is we're going to get into the last chapter in the book of 1 Peter. And what we're going to find here are instructions for how the church can promote healthy relationships. And these instructions are given to different members within this spiritual family, starting with instructions to pastors. So you can go ahead and turn in your Bibles to 1 Peter chapter 5, and we'll be starting in verse 1. We'll also have the words up here on the screen. Before we get into it, now there might be some of you who are thinking, wait a minute, if these instructions are for pastors, then why do I need to pay attention to this? Like, I'm not a pastor. I have no intentions of being a pastor. What's the point of talking about this? And that's a valid question, and I could think of at least 3 reasons for why this whole conversation is important for all of us. One reason is that our church might hire another pastor sometime in the future. Now, I'm not saying this because I have plans to make that happen anytime soon. But as our church grows and as ministry opportunities expand, we might be in a place where it would be helpful to hire another pastor. And if and when that time comes, I think it's so important for all of us as a church family to know what to look for in a pastor. We don't want to just pick anybody who's been to Bible college. We don't want to pick somebody based on a gut feeling and just hope that things work out in the end. And so I hope that this whole passage here will give us some clarity on what to look for in a pastor. The second reason why this is helpful for all of us is that as the pastor of this church, I should be held accountable to the instructions that we're about to be reading this morning. I don't think it's an overstatement to say that a pastor can make or break the ministry of a church. And this is something that I take so seriously. Like, if you see my life and my ministry going down the wrong path, like, please help me do what it takes to get back on track. And so this is important for all of us to know as a church, because I think just within Christian culture in general, there's kind of two extremes. Now, there's one extreme where people just criticize everything about a pastor's leadership. They just nitpick every little detail. The other extreme is where church culture and people in the church kind of just sweep things under the rug that a pastor does that should not be swept under the rug. And so my hope is that as we get into these instructions, we will know the kinds of things that a pastor should be held accountable to. And then lastly, you don't have to have an official role as a pastor to be pastoral. The whole role of being a pastor is about loving people and helping people to follow Jesus. And I think as followers of Jesus, like, to some extent, we are all called to do that. And so as we get into these instructions for pastors, I think that all of us can learn and grow in the area of loving people and leading people to follow the example of Jesus. So let's go ahead and read it. And I'll just warn you ahead of time, Peter uses the word elder to refer to pastors. The Bible uses the word elder, overseer, and pastor interchangeably, but it's all talking about the same role. So let's go ahead and read in 1 Peter chapter 5, starting in verse 1. It says, "And now a word to you who are elders in the church. I too am an elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and I too will share in his glory when he is revealed to the whole world. As a fellow elder, I appeal to you, care for the flock God has entrusted to you. Watch over it willingly, not grudgingly, not for what you will get out of it, but because you are eager to serve God. Don't lord it over people assigned to your care, but lead them by your own good example. And when the great shepherd appears, you will receive a crown of never-ending glory and honor." Now, one of the questions you might have just from reading this is, well, how old does somebody have to be before they can become a pastor or an elder? Because even the term elder seems to point back to something about age. And after all, nobody would look at me and think that I am elderly by any stretch. And so what I think the Bible seems to say about this is that being an elder or a pastor doesn't have so much to do with reaching a certain age in your life, but it has more to do with spiritual maturity and leadership. There's a passage in the Bible that says that people who recently become followers of Jesus shouldn't jump into the position of a pastor. And the reason for that is these new believers need time to just learn and grow in their faith before they lead people from the role of a pastor. And then the Apostle Paul kind of mentored a young pastor named Timothy. And it kind of sets a precedent for there being young pastors. And Paul says to Timothy in one of his letters, "Don't let anybody despise your youth, but be a good example." So again, the emphasis is on being a person of high character and leading people the way that Jesus would want people to be led. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't value to the kind of wisdom that comes from age and experience. And I am so thankful for our deacon team and the people who are part of this ministry who have more wisdom and experience than I do in life. Like I said before, you don't have to be a pastor to be pastoral. And here at our church, our deacon team is very pastoral. Like, the guys on that team set a great example of living for Jesus. And these guys are so serious about seeing our church be healthy and be effective in reaching people with the message of Jesus. And so I lean on them a lot when it comes to making decisions in the direction of where this church is going. And I think that is one of the greatest strengths of our church. Like, as the pastor of this ministry, I am so thankful for those men and their leadership. And I look at the momentum and the amazing things that God is doing through this ministry. And I think that those men have a very big part to play in it. Just like pastors can make or break a ministry of the church, that kind of supportive group of pastoral people can also make or break the ministry of a church. So Peter, the one who is writing these instructions, was also a pastor. Now, some pastors talk about being called into the ministry, and what their calling looks like might be different from person to person. But what's interesting about Peter's story is that Jesus literally called Peter into the ministry. And the crazy part of this story is that this is after Peter had denied Jesus 3 times. Like, before Jesus was arrested and before Jesus went to the cross, Jesus told Peter, "You are going to deny me 3 times." And Peter was like, "No, Jesus, I would never do that." Well, of course, Jesus was right. And so Jesus gets arrested, and some other people are like, "Hey, aren't you a disciple of that Jesus guy?" And Peter was like, "No, I don't know what you're talking about." And Peter did that 3 times. And after the 3rd time, he was like, "Oh no, this is what Jesus said would happen, and I did it." He's like, "I messed up." And he was just broken over it, to the point where I'm sure Peter thought he was done with ministry. He was probably thinking, you know what, there's no way that Jesus wants to use me in his plans for whatever it is that Jesus is doing, because I've blown it. Peter went right back to catching fish, because that's what he was doing for a living before he became a disciple of Jesus. And it was in that moment, after Jesus had raised from the dead, that he met up with Peter, and he called Peter into the ministry. And this is recorded for us in the book of John. It says, after breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," Peter replied. "You know I love you." "Then feed my lambs," Jesus told him. Jesus repeated the question, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord," Peter said. "You know I love you." "Then take care of my sheep," Jesus said. And then a 3rd time he asked him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question a 3rd time. He said, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Then feed my sheep." So all throughout the Bible, people are compared to sheep. And so when Jesus is telling Peter to take care of and to feed his sheep, what he's saying is, "Peter, I want you to take care of and lead the other followers of Jesus." And we see some of that imagery of being like a shepherd echoed in the instructions here in 1 Peter. And so here's a summary of these instructions for elders. Elders are called to lead and feed the church according to the example of Jesus. And the example of Jesus is so incredibly important. Listen, leading a group of people, piece of cake. Leading people in the right direction, that's a whole different story. And that's what this is all about. And so here in this passage in 1 Peter, Peter refers to Jesus as the great shepherd. And I think that when Peter refers to Jesus as the great shepherd, he probably has in the back of his mind one of the teachings that Jesus gave during his earthly ministry. Remember, Peter was one of Jesus' original 12 disciples. And so he got to see Jesus do ministry firsthand. He got to hear Jesus' teachings firsthand. And there's a teaching where Jesus compares himself to a good shepherd. And this is recorded for us in John chapter 10. And then in verse 11, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd sacrifices his life for the sheep. A hired hand will run when he sees a wolf coming. He will abandon the sheep because they don't belong to him and he isn't their shepherd. And so the wolf attacks them and scatters the flock. The hired hand runs away because he's working only for the money and doesn't really care about the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own sheep and they know me. Just as my Father knows me and I know the Father, so I sacrifice my life for the sheep. I have other sheep too that are not in the sheepfold. I must bring them also. They will listen to my voice, and there will be one flock with one shepherd. And he goes on to say, the Father loves me because I sacrifice my life so I may take it back again. No one can take my life from me. I sacrifice it voluntarily, for I have the authority to lay it down when I want to and also to take it up again. For this is what my Father has commanded. So here, Jesus is comparing himself as like a good shepherd to just some hired hand who's taking care of the sheep. Here's kind of a breakdown of that comparison. The good shepherd sacrifices his life for the sheep, and that's motivated by love. The hired hand, if the hired hand sees a wolf coming at the sheep, he's just going to run away. He's like, I'm not dealing with a wolf. I'm out of here. Why? Because he doesn't love the sheep. He's just working that job to collect a paycheck. And that's the difference between the good shepherd and the hired hand. The good shepherd knows his sheep. He has a relationship with the sheep. And the good shepherd voluntarily sacrifices his own life for the sake of the sheep. Like nobody's twisting his arm to do it. It's not coming from a place of just obligation, but it's coming from a place of love. And so this whole kind of comparison, I think, is echoed in 1 Peter, where Peter compares a good pastor, or at least qualities of a good pastor, with qualities of a bad pastor. And so this is what we see here, that a good pastor cares for people. A good pastor watches over people. Well, a bad pastor also watches over people. That's kind of the job that you're in. But what really matters is the motivation. The motivation for the good pastor is to watch over people willingly. The motivation for the bad pastor is to go about it grudgingly. Or at least that's their attitude. A good pastor is motivated by a desire to serve God. And a bad pastor is just motivated by personal gain, like what they can get out of that position of influence. A good pastor leads by example, and a bad pastor leads by demands. And so, at the end of the day, the goal of any pastor, really any follower of Jesus, is to follow the example of Jesus. This next slide here just shows that comparison between the good pastor and the good shepherd. And you can see there's kind of some overlap here. The good pastor cares for people, watches over people, does it willingly, is motivated by a desire to serve, and leads by example. The good shepherd, Jesus, sacrifices his life for the sheep, is motivated by love, knows his sheep, has a relationship with them, and voluntarily sacrifices his life. And so whether you're a pastor or just a follower of Jesus, I think all of us are encouraged and challenged to follow the example of Jesus in the way that we live our lives, to set a good example, the way that we love people, in the way that we serve people. Now we're going to take a look at the next instruction in the book of 1 Peter, and this instruction is targeted at the younger people in the church. This is the beginning part of verse 5. It says, in the same way, you who are younger must accept the authority of the elders. So, because this is targeted at younger people, does this mean that if you're older, you get a free pass and you don't have to do this? Like, I don't know what the age cutoff is, but younger, let's say you're 40 years old. Does that mean that you don't have to accept the authority of the elders or the leadership of the church? Like, after all, you're at an age where you would probably know better. Well, sorry to burst your bubble, but I don't think that's the case. Just because this instruction is targeted at younger people, it doesn't mean that older people don't have to live this out, or that it doesn't apply to them. It's kind of like if I had a whole bunch of people over to my house and I said, all right, kids, listen up. Do not touch the burner on the stove because that will hurt you. Now, does that mean that anybody else who's not a kid should touch the burner on the stove? Probably not. Not a good idea. But I targeted the younger kids with that instruction because that's the age demographic that is more prone to go touching hot stuff. And I think that Peter is doing the same thing. He is targeting this instruction at younger people in the church because this is the age demographic that is probably more prone to resist leadership within the church. But I think that there is a principle behind this that applies to all of us. And so the summary of this whole section here is that for the youth, they are called to be willing to be led and fed, to follow leadership. I was one time trying to work through a difficult situation in the church, and I feel like God just spoke to my heart and reminded me that some sheep like to be fed but not led. Now let's just unpack that illustration a little bit. So sheep probably like to just stand there and eat food. And eating food is a good thing. Like, sheep need to eat food for their nourishment, so I don't want to downplay that. But at the same time, standing around and eating food is pretty comfortable. Like, if I was a sheep, I would be totally content to just stand there and eat grass all day long. Now, compare that to being led by a shepherd. Oftentimes, a shepherd would lead his sheep to a place that has more or better food. He would lead his sheep to a place that has better shelter. And in leading his sheep, sometimes that sheep had to leave its comfort zone. Sometimes that sheep had to go to a place that sheep had never been to before and had to trust the leadership of the shepherd. That's uncomfortable for a sheep. And I think that can be true for us as well. You know, sometimes following godly leadership is uncomfortable. And the mission of our church is to make more and better Jesus followers. The mission of our church is not to just make church more comfortable for us. And sometimes what it takes to reach people with the message of Jesus isn't easy. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. Sometimes it means setting aside our preferences, or just it's harder. Even becoming a better follower of Jesus is not easy. That means leaving our comfort zone. The Bible talks about, if you want to be a follower of Jesus, what that looks like is denying yourself, taking up your cross, and following him. In a sense, like, you are dying to yourself to live for Jesus. That's not comfortable. That is not easy. And as followers of Jesus, we need to be fed from God's word, but not just stop there, but to live it out and to follow the leaders in the church who are following the leadership of Jesus. And then we'll take a look at the next instruction here, and this is the final one. This is instruction for everybody. Starting in the last part of verse 5, it says, "And all of you dress yourselves in humility as you relate to one another. For God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. So humble yourselves under the mighty power of God, and at the right time he will lift you up in honor." So the summary of this whole section is to embrace humility. And that's the next slide up here. Now, humility is not just thinking that you're a worthless person who can't do anything right and just mentally beating yourself up. That's not humility. That's just beating yourself up. I really think that humility is seeing ourselves the way that God sees us. If we see ourselves the way that God sees us, that is the most accurate view of ourselves that we could ever have. And pride is the exact opposite of that. Pride is having an inflated view of ourselves. Pride is thinking that we are better than other people. Pride is thinking that we're better at something than we really are. And when we have a heart attitude of pride, oftentimes it leads us to treat other people like we think we're better than them. And humility is the opposite of that. Like if we can see ourselves the way that God sees us, then that's the first step towards seeing other people the way that God sees them. And then that's a step towards treating other people the way that God would want those people to be treated. And so humility, it starts first in our hearts and our minds, but it's expressed in the way that we treat other people and putting the needs of others above our own. And I think this is so important for relationships in the church. Like I said before, like healthy relationships have kind of a give and take, but healthier relationships have more of a give and putting the needs of others above your own. And I think that if we can get this right as a church, if we can get this right as a family of believers, this is a huge step towards being an example to those around us of the difference that it can make to have Jesus in our lives and to follow his example and to treat people the way that God would want us to treat other people. And so, just as we wrap up, I just want to briefly ask this one question, and this one question is, what is your next step? As we think through all of these things with relationships, what is God laying on your heart to do? I think that as we live in a culture where people are just so sick and tired of messy, hard, dysfunctional relationships, people are looking to alternatives. They're looking to things like AI, but I think a better alternative than that is the kinds of relationships that people can see in the church.